So hello and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Megan McCoy, and I'm a PhD student in history and a doctoral fellow at the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. On behalf of the Clough Center and the Winston Center on Leadership and Ethics, which is a co-sponsor of today's keynote session, I am delighted to introduce Ms. Maria Hinojosa and Dr. Carlo Rotella to you all today. I love all the applause. It's very exciting. Maria Hinojosa began working as a journalist nearly 30 years ago and is now one of the most successful individuals in her field. Although she was oftentimes the first Latina in many newsrooms when she began working as a reporter, those experiences motivated her to create spaces for independent, multimedia journalism that could explore and lend a critical voice to the diverse and complex American experience. These aspirations eventually became reality in the form of Futuro Media, an independent, nonprofit organization that Ms. Hinojosa founded in 2010. Based in Harlem, New York City, Futuro Media produces multimedia content, quote, for and about the new American mainstream in the service of empowering people to navigate the complexities of an increasingly diverse and connected world. In addition to founding and running Futuro Media, Ms. Hinojosa has reported for national networks including PBS, CBS, WNBC, CNN, NPR, and she anchored the Emmy Award-winning talk show Maria Hinojosa, One-on-One on WGBH. Much of her work is about reporting on stories that were, or still are, rarely talked about. During her 8 years as CNN's urban affairs correspondent, Ms. Hinojosa covered communities that were almost never shown on television, while at NPR, she was one of the first journalists to report on youth violence in urban communities on a national scale. Finally, although I could certainly go on, at Futuro Media, Ms. Hinojosa's primary concern is bringing to the fore points of view and experiences that have been previously overlooked or underreported in mainstream media, all while teaching the next generation of journalists to do the same by prioritizing complex, authentic, and nuanced stories. On top of her incredible career, Ms. Hinojosa has also published 2 books and is the recipient of numerous awards, including 4 Emmys, the John Chancellor Award, the Studs Terkel Community Media Award, 2 Robert F. Kennedy Awards, and the Edward R. Murrow Award from the Overseas Press Club. Additionally, and I think this is pretty cool, Ms. Hinojosa was honored with her own day in October by former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, and that's neat when you have your own day, that's pretty cool, and was recognized by People en Español as one of the 25 most powerful Latina women. In 2018, she was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And in 2019, she was named the inaugural Distinguished Journalist in Residence at her alma mater, Barnard College. She is a frequent speaker across the country, which is thankfully why we're delighted to welcome her to Boston College today. Please come.
Oh boy, yikes. Okay, it's not a podium for short people. You see, you can't see me? No, okay. Hi, how's lunch? Okay, it's a bit of a challenge to talk to a group of journalists when they're having lunch. I'm gonna speak for a little bit, and then Carlo and I are gonna have a conversation, and we will reveal just how many years it is that I have known Carlo Rotella. You will be shocked. So this morning, in all honesty, I flew in from paradise last night. I was in the Dominican Republic for the last week, actually healing from a lot of the reporting, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And this morning early, I had breakfast with my colleague, Julio Ricardo Varela, who's right there. He's my co-host for our podcast, In the Thick, which is our version of Meet the Press with a lot more F-bombs. And I got actually really inspired after our conversation because I was sharing with Julio a lot of what I'm feeling, right? Because Charles was talking about being on the ground, being like doing it. And I've been doing it for the last 3 months. I've been on the ground doing the ground truth. And oh my God, for those of us who are journalists, it's just like, it's heaven. It's heaven. But it's also hell. It's also hell because of the stories that I'm covering, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's why going and taking a week and disconnecting from the phone and just being as far away from what I've been reporting on was so good. But then I got inspired because Julio and I were talking about things that we're doing, projects. Julio is a colleague of mine at Futuro Media and the founder of Latino Rebels, which is a fabulous site, which, by the way, mergers and acquisitions, that was our first acquisition, was Latino Rebels. I said, we need to do this, and so he's my friend, so it was a good, it was amicable. So this morning when I sat down to write, actually, I had written a different speech and then I decided to write a new one. And I wrote, I'm feeling desperate but also enthusiastic. And I think that that's my feeling as a journalist right now. There's a lot of desperation. In fact, I'm feeling, if I had to kind of give a sense of where I'm feeling right now in this moment in my career, I feel kind of hopeless about so many of the structural issues, structural racism, white supremacy, misogyny, etc. But also at the same time, I'm so convinced about the role that we as journalists have to play. And Charlie and I never really sat down and talked about this, but the whole notion of democracy, like I call myself a democracy junkie. That's ultimately why I do what I do, is because of this deep, crazy, phenomenal commitment to democracy. And that's because I was not born an American citizen. And I'll get to that in a second. So I wrote this morning, I practice journalism of indignation. This is a theme that I got from Elena Poniatowska. If any of you read Spanish, I don't know if she's been translated, but she should be. Elena Poniatowska is an incredible daughter of Polish refugees in Mexico. She's about 90 years old now, and she wrote, Yo practico el periodismo de la indignación, journalism of indignation. And I find myself indignant a lot of the time, which is, right? We're best friends, girl. Even though we've never met, we're like, I love you, and we're going to hang out. Like, me and Joan, it's like, you're going to see it. It's going to be this fabulous platonic love story. Yeah, we're going to go shopping. Okay, you see that? That's what I'm talking about. We're going to talk deep politics, democracy, and fascism. Thank you, Joan, for bringing up fascism, because at its core, that is what I'm fighting against, ultimately, like profoundly. Anyway, so I wrote, I do this because I started on a thing about why do I do this? I do this because my parents taught me about what this country says it values, the First Amendment. I do this because as a little Mexican kid, on the south side of Chicago, right? On Sunday nights, I'd be watching 60 Minutes with my family. And this is where I fell in love with our profession, right? I do this because I fell in love with Ed Bradley, Mike Wallace, and Walter Cronkite, and Bill Moyers. Bunch of dudes. By the way, I've won all of the awards named after white men in the United States, except for one. I have not won the DuPont, but who's counting? But other than that, every single journalism award named for white men. But Ed Bradley was the man who spoke to me, and that was an extraordinary moment to see Ed Bradley reporting on the field on the front lines of Vietnam. It gave me hope, even though he was obviously not a woman. So I do this because I uncovered my own story because of the work of a colleague named Ginger Thompson, who works at ProPublica, and I realized that even though I had talked about this, it was like, let me just say it, right? That the transformation of my life as I am, as a person of this country, And my understanding of my role in this country was really set on a path because of the work of Ginger Thompson doing investigative work with a whistleblower at ProPublica. You know what she did. She got a whistleblower to record the sounds of the babies and children and toddlers that were being caged, which was the height of that moment, but that's not the first time children were taken from their parents, and it's not the last. It's still happening now. So what happened because you're like, well, what's the story? So I had always known that something had happened to me when I arrived in this country, with total privilege, by the way. I came with a green card, I came by plane, I came with my mother, who was wearing a fancy, fancy skirt and her kitten heels, and the 4 Mexican kids, all of us coming to meet my dad. Privilege, who was hired at the University of Chicago to be the person who was going to work on helping to create the cochlear implant. May he rest in peace. So, so I was coming to this country with privilege. Something happened at the immigration checkpoint in Dallas at the airport, because we flew from Mexico City to Dallas, Dallas to Chicago. And it was when Ginger Thompson put the sounds of those children and toddlers crying was when it all clicked. It's when my mom called me. My mom, already in her 80s, called me. And she was crying on the phone. And when your mother calls you crying on the phone, of course, you're like, ¿Quién se murió? Who died? No, mi hijita, no. Es que, you know, I've been hearing the stories, the voices of the babies and the children. I'm like, I know, Mom, it's horrible. It's just so terrible. And she's like, I know it's so terrible. And I feel so much. I identify with the moms. And I was like, I know, Mom, you know, I understand how hard it is. I was like, Mom, I feel it too. And she's like, no, mijita. Because I was like, I understand, Mom, this is hard. And she was like, no, mijita. And she did the Mexican thing. No, mijita, ponme atención. Like, I'm talking to you. That was me. The moms, that was me. And the little kids and the babies, that was almost you. And I'm like, ¿Cómo? And she says, that's what happened at the Dallas airport. The immigration agent saw that I had a rash, therefore, trigger warning, I'm gonna release a slur, therefore, I was a dirty Mexican. Okay, by law, on Texas state books, you had to check the bodies of Mexicans up until 1964, and if we were dirty, we were not allowed in. So he was just doing his job. He saw that I was sick, and he said, ma'am, just give me the little baby, I'm just gonna take her, and we're just gonna keep her here. And the 4 of you, yourself and your 3 other kids, you can go up to Chicago, we're just gonna keep her here. And it was in that moment when my mom said, they tried to take you. And I'm in an airport, because journalists are always in airports, right? And I realized, like I felt like I had been hit by a cannon. You know, I was like, oh, now I know. Now I know why I do what I do. Now I understand profoundly why I do what I do. It was tied to that trauma. And people are like, that's crazy. And it's like, well, maybe, but part of what we as journalists have to do is also understand and trust our gut and our instinct. And I knew. That is why I do what I do. That is why people have been criticizing me. If you follow my career, they're always like, why do you always have to report about immigrants? Why are you so immigrant-y, so Mexican-y? You know? Why? And people think I'm just obsessed with immigrants. No, I'm actually obsessed with this country's capacity for inhumanity. And it is manifested by how we treat immigrant and refugee bodies. That's what I'm obsessed with. You think I'm obsessed with immigration? No. I'm obsessed with this country's capacity for inhumanity. I do this because that love of falling in love with 60 Minutes and all those guys, I mean, you know I love them. Like, I know all their names, Morley Safer, Harry Reasoner, like I knew all these guys, right? Well, that was my dream, right? Was to get a job at 60 Minutes. It's every journalist's dream. And I got this close, right? I got a meeting. I think I should have realized when they were like, let's meet at the Starbucks, that I was like, probably not gonna be very good. And the gentleman said to me, you know, Maria, you're so perfect for us. Oh my God, you're so perfect. But can you do me a favor? Can you wait until one of these, oh my gosh, right here. He was like, we've got this long line of old white men 2, 3 lines. Can you wait until one of them gets sick or dies and then come back? And I was like, am I laughing or am I crying? Obviously, I wasn't getting a job, so I did get on the A train at 59th Street and cried all the way to Harlem, because how was I going to tell my dad that my dream, was over? Like, it was not going to happen at 60 Minutes. Papi, he already had Alzheimer's. But I also knew that I couldn't tell my dad and say, Papi, I'm going on unemployment because I couldn't find a job. That's the immigrant in me. They say that we're takers. Actually, we're the ones who will be the least takers of those. Believe me. So people had been saying to me, do your own thing, create your own thing. And I'm like, I'm a journalist. I can't, I don't run anything. I'm a journalist. Yes, but we believe in what in the way you tell these stories, create something. And so thankfully, I was very lucky to be able to get with a group of people and create Futuro Media in the midst of tears. And the funding is so central, right? Because, so the story goes that the way we got funded is because my funder was a massive philanthropist, but I got to meet her in anonymity because she was giving free treatment after 9/11 in Reiki. And I had such severe PTSD that I went to see her, and we built this bond, and then only later did I realize who she was. She was the one who said, I'll give you the money to start your nonprofit, which, by the way, so many people laughed at me for creating a nonprofit. They were like, oh, Maria, you're so silly. You and all of your crazy ideas. You can make a nonprofit. To me, journalism is of service and is of mission. So I've never understood that you want to make money off of this profession. I understand it can be discussed, but that was just not my motivation. And I'm so glad I didn't create a nonprofit and then I'm so glad I didn't create a for-profit and then get bought and then get sold and then get killed, right? That's not what Futuro Media is going to do. I do this because when I was accused of having a Latino agenda by a white male editor who was my editor at NPR, and when somebody says, well, you have an agenda, and this was the 90s, I was like, what? And I had a great retort, thank God, because most of the time when we're said these things, these microaggressions, and I was like, well, then you must have a white male agenda. And he was like, it's not the same thing. And I was like, yes, it is. But then I went and I thought about, well, so what is my agenda? Do I have an agenda? It's not a Latino agenda. I have an agenda that I want people to feel things. I want people to feel. I want to have that feeling that I had when I saw Ed Bradley on the front lines in Vietnam reporting that I could feel his heart somehow. Certainly Bill Moyers, when he was sitting at the CBS Evening News and giving his commentary, I could feel his heart. So I decided that, that was my agenda, that I didn't have a problem creating journalism that was going to touch you so hard that you would feel something and that you wouldn't forget that. I do this because now we all know that sending a Christmas card to a source who's going to spend the rest of his life in prison is actually not an act of a lack of objectivity or a lack of or a lack of being able to be fair. It's actually, sending a Christmas card is one of the many things, the tools that we have in our tool belt as journalists, right? Actually, compassion. Now, I don't know, I actually cared about this young man who I met, whose name is Suave. He's now very famous. Because if you didn't know and you haven't listened, I'm assuming some of you haven't listened, right? So Suave ends up winning the Pulitzer last year. That's why you should listen. Actually, you should have listened even before the Pulitzer, but that's okay. But what we did with Suave was that my team, because I said here, I have years of conversations, what is this? And my team came back and they said, what it is a relationship between a source and a journalist and his story. But as a result, you're not going to produce this. And I was like, bet. And I pulled out and let my team of producers work on that. And we went straight into the conversation about, well, what happens if you develop a relationship with a source? In other words, what we do at Futuro Media is we practice radical transparency and honesty. We don't want to pull the wool over your eyes. We want you to understand. And honestly, if you didn't see the video of me winning the Pulitzer, where I looked completely shocked, it's because I was completely shocked. I didn't even know that my team had submitted. So the last thing I was expecting was to win a Pulitzer, and it's a beautiful thing, honestly. It was, I know, I'm just like, it's like fabulous, because it is a recognition of all of the decades of work. And by the way, there were many times in those decades of work when I was told, even by my own colleagues, at my own company that I formed, right? You too? It was kind of like, Suave, what's this story? Who is this guy? Because I was the one that was talking to him. I was the one that was going to prison. I was the one who was in touch. For everybody else, he was just a distracting phone call. Which is why you should never give up on a story, right? Which is why we as journalists need to have that support to keep us in that capacity to keep a relationship going for 30-something years. Now Suave is out. But you should still listen to the podcast because it's very dramatic. And we're working on season 2. And I told Julio this morning, I was like, season 2 is going to be even more dramatic because we're focusing on a case that I can't even talk about it. It's so complex. And Suave is no longer just a subject, he's a producer. Because Futuro Media does things differently as we talk. And by the way, so much respect to everybody who's been part of this conference. I learned so much. I feel overwhelmed when I hear all of my colleagues talking, because I'm just like, wow, they're so smart. I'm not thinking about these things because I'm on the ground doing this other work. But thankfully, all of these colleagues, all of you are doing this work. So I'm so deeply thankful because we are talking about saving democracy. I do this because I was assigned at CNN to go down to the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And then saw the tower collapse from several blocks away, and was convinced at that moment that I had just lost all of my colleagues from CNN. And thankfully that didn't happen, but I did develop PTSD, something that we didn't talk about. And that I treated, by the way, with what's now called cannabis. You can laugh, thank you. Oh, I was smoking pot, something I had not done, but that was how I was taking care of my PTSD and doing my talk therapy. But it was the thing that kept me the most worried, because I knew one day someone's going to reveal that Maria Hinojosa smokes pot, and her entire credibility will be lost. I don't worry about that now because I'm a medical marijuana patient in the state of Connecticut. So come at me. You can't do jack. And it feels so good to be that radically transparent because no tengo nada que esconder. I have nothing to hide. But that trauma that I experienced during September 11th is what also allows me to do the work now, right? It allows me to understand how we as a society, and that's why a lot of what we're talking about, it feels very overwhelming, right? We're talking about saving democracy and we're like, Jesus, we used to be 500,000 journalists and there's like less than 100,000 of us now, and how are we gonna save? How are we gonna do this? I mean, it feels completely overwhelming, very much so. So, to me, this is why we do what we do. We understand, and that's why for me at this precise moment when I'm feeling very overwhelmed institutionally, and because of the trauma that I'm reporting on, I'm about to get to that, that I've understood how we have to transform this trauma into, there's rage. I'm sure you're all feeling it as we hear these conversations. And so how do you transform trauma and rage into something extraordinary and positive that's filled with light? That's kind of the essence of Futuro Media, right? Remember, it was born from me crying in a subway. And we've transformed into something that is incredibly hopeful, but also that models what I believe is excellence in journalism. So if your newsroom is not representative, you're not practicing excellence in journalism. That's just the way I talk about it now. So newsroom conferences that talk about us, but you don't have a representative newsroom, you're light years behind where we are. That is practicing excellence in journalism. And practicing excellence in journalism is that whole connection to local journalism. To me, I used to read the Hyde Park Herald. You too, Carlo. It was essential, but I was also watching 60 Minutes. When I formed Futuro Media, I knew I didn't want to be in Midtown. I needed to be in my community, in the heart of Harlem on 125th Street, because I wanted us to be able to say we produce award-winning national journalism from a local perspective, local connection, frontline, ground truth, because we're right there in Harlem. I do this because even when I feel devastated, I know I can't give in. So, the good news about winning a Pulitzer is it does make you feel more fearless, which I think we need. Because what's happened recently as I've gotten even bolder, it's like, okay, is that now I face harassment from two countries. My country of my birth, Mexico, and my country, the one that I chose to become a citizen of, which is the United States. So because of my reporting, doing deep criticism of the current Mexican president and his collaboration with the Trump administration, that reporting, which we call the moving border, got it so that when I landed in Mexico in November of 2020, after our story had run, Mexican immigration officials took away my American passport and put me in the back room for 45 minutes. That's what it feels like. And then what it feels like more recently is just a month or two ago, I was denied global access, global entry. TSA, global entry they denied it. So as Julio says, it's like your own country is telling you that you're not part of this country. And I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but yeah. And that's because guess who stamps global entry? It's the Border Patrol. Who is in my target? The Border Patrol. Why? Because it is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States of America that happens to be majority Latino and Latina. With so little oversight. And the levels of corruption inside the Border Patrol are extraordinary. So I'm not surprised that me deciding to take on the Border Patrol would end up with me being harassed by my own government. Thankfully, there is something called social media, and so I already put out one video, and I think today I'm going to put out another one that's just going to be like, that's right, this is what it looks like to be somebody who is considered a threat to this country. Answer me that. In this point in my career, I never thought that I would end up taking on another major institution, which is the DEA. I was like, seriously? But the question about telling a good story and how to find a way to tell a good story and how we have to kind of go to those basics, and they live in local, obviously, in local settings, is kind of coming upon the story of Genaro Garcia Luna. And if you're like, Genaro who, what? Just listen to our podcast. It's called USA versus Garcia Luna. And it was the second largest drug trial, second to El Chapo. And you're like, how didn't I hear about this? How didn't you hear about this from our colleagues? It's because actually, when the narco story and the corruption story is told better from Breaking Bad or Ozark, and that's how we understand corruption in the United States, then it's very easy to just say, oh, those corrupt Mexicans. Oh, those corrupt Mexicans. And so nobody covered the story except we did. And it took off hugely, bigly, right? So suddenly we not only had a huge audience in the United States, but we had Mexico clamoring for a Spanish language version of that podcast, which, by the way, used humor. And to the chagrin of my lawyer, a bottle of tequila. I was like, you can't make this stuff up. My colleague, Benilei Ramirez, has been investigating this guy. I need a bottle of tequila, and I don't drink. I was like, let's just do this so that we can, because this is stranger than fiction, And it took off because we did it in a way, as we like to say, we approached investigative journalism from a very feminist woman, two Latina journalists who become obsessed with this story, and then we actually laugh. So it's a good thing to have laughter in our work. Actually, it's really important. Think about the podcasts that you listen to and why you may come back to them because there is an element of humor or levity. How do we handle such serious issues, but at the same time, make it something that people, in my case, want to listen to, in the case of audio? So, the work that I'm doing now, I'm going to tell you, but you can't tweet it out, okay? So, I'm going to go off the record for a second. It's not being live streamed, is it? It is being live streamed? Then I can't say anything. Too bad. I'm not going to tell you who I'm doing this work for, but I am doing a major film and podcast about Uvalde, the massacre in Uvalde, Texas, the second largest school massacre, second to Sandy Hook, Connecticut, which, by the way, I have a home that is 20 minutes away from Sandy Hook, but I didn't cover that story. But I'm covering Uvalde, which is in South Texas. It's where I'm flying back on Monday morning. And the story of Uvalde, and then I'm going to end up, because what I wanted to tell you is that the trauma that I experienced from PTSD as a journalist has allowed me to go into Uvalde and be with the people where they are right now, with not even 1 year of trauma under their belts. But the big headline is that Uvalde, South Texas, you're like, where is it? So Texas, it's here. And you're like, what? That part of the country actually is one of the places where the birth of the Chicana movement in the United States. And if you're like, what is Chicano or Chicana? Please look it up. You should know that. And if you didn't know that, it's not your fault. It's because we don't learn our own history, right? But the Chicana movement of this country, it was born in this part of South Texas and in Los Angeles. Uvalde was in Newsweek, New York Times, Time magazine in the year 1970. Already Uvalde was a national story. Why? Because it was the place of one of the longest student walkouts in American history. Why? Because if you spoke Spanish at Robb Elementary School, you would be paddled. That's why. A ruler would be taken out of a glass of water and they would slap you on the back of the calf if you spoke Spanish. And the Latinos and Latinas, the Mexicanos and Mexicanas of Uvalde se acabó hasta aquí, and they walked out. So the story of how it happens at a place that manifested such resistance to cultural oppression actually becomes a place where we witness one of our own massacring his own in his own classroom. How does that happen? And why? So the story, though, is that from that, just like the way Futuro and so much of what we've done is born out of this frustration, right, is that there's a next generation of Uvalde survivors who are speaking truth to power in a way that's extraordinary. And that's the film that we're going to make. That's the film that we are making as we speak. They're like, how soon can we send you some more cuts? I'm like, I'll be at the airport in a couple hours. We are in the midst of making it because it has to run before the 1 year anniversary, which is May 24th. I do this because, so we're clear. The kids who were massacred in Uvalde were 10 years old. The most common age, the median age of Latinos and Latinas in the United States right now is 11. 11. So our reporting that is actually focusing on this population is not just because that population has been made to feel invisible and directly targeted, but because Latinos and Latinas represent the future of democracy in this country. Do we understand that? Right now, Latinos and Latinas are the second largest voting cohort in the United States. White voters, Latina voters, Black voters. So how we use media for our community to understand the power that we have to save democracy, that's why we do what we do. That's why being in Texas for me is a pain, because it's really far from New York. But I have not given up on the state of Texas, nor on the state of Florida, nor on the state of Oklahoma, or any of those states. They are all part of this hope for democracy that we cannot dismiss. So finally, I'm just going to tell you this one little last, because I think it's a visual fun. It really has nothing to do with a great ending. I should have a great ending. But I'm going to tell you about how, like, corruption, because I'm kind of obsessed with corruption right now in the United States, because I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the narrative of like, oh my God, our country is so perfect, but y'all, don't send us your people, because y'all are like, So in the Garcia Luna trial, it turned out that the Sinaloa cartel and El Chapo were basically running the Mexico City airport. As the prosecutor said, it became the FedEx of cocaine. There were so many planes loaded with tons of cocaine. But you know, the thing about corruption is that, so the planes are loaded with all of that corruption in the Mexico City airport, all those corrupt people, all that corruption that gets to the airplanes filled with cocaine, and then the plane takes off and it makes its way over to the United States, and it crosses that wall. And as it lands in JFK, all the corruption is gone. Oh my God. You just land a plane at JFK, and the cocaine just kind of, ends up on the streets. That's what I'm talking about. And so our job is to love our democracy. But because I chose to become an American citizen and had to raise my right hand and say I would take up arms to defend this country, and I don't like guns, that's why I hold this country accountable as a journalist. That's why I do what I do. That's why we do what we do. Thank you. Thank you. So I've known Carlo since, let's see, how old is Sebastian?
Let's see. What we have in common is neither one of us took journalism classes at our high school.
We went to high school together, sort of, right? Because you were there right as I was leaving.
Yeah.
We kind of crossed paths, so.
So I'm aware of the clock, and I just want to ask a question and then turn it over to whoever wants to ask. So let me ask you a detailed question about telling a good story. I feel like many of us in the room got our training as reporters in order for that reporting to end up as a piece of writing. And it even shapes the way you think about doing your reporting, is that you're going to end up writing it up. And you have been doing visual stuff and especially oral stuff. And so I guess I wanted to ask you about podcasting. I listened to the Suave podcast and the Garcia Luna podcast, and the Suave one is really a deep character study, and the Garcia Luna one is more investigative deep dive. So
with a bottle of tequila.
Right. So I guess the question is, thinking about the nuts and bolts of telling a good story, does the fact that it's going to end up in a podcast change the way you do the kind of reporting that we've been hearing in various ways journalists need to do in order for a democracy to function properly?
I mean, that's such a kind of inside baseball question, but yeah. I mean, I'm working on multiple projects at the same time. So as you know, for film, it's a whole other world when you're working for film, because especially when you're doing high-level documentary film, everything takes 2 to 3 hours just to set up for the interview. So there's a whole other thing that happens. When I go back on Monday to Uvalde, I'm not taking a camera, So how I'm approaching that is kind of a sense of liberation, because it makes me very nimble. It makes the conversations with people super nimble. But your question about how I approach a story, because I was my first language, actually was right here in Brookline on Lytle Street, where I was going to Coolidge Corner, and because my dad got a residency at Harvard, so I was here. This is like one of my first memories of speaking English was actually here. So I didn't feel like English was a language that I could write well at all. And there were a few high school teachers that made me be sure of that. But what I do remember, and there's this great episode called Chisme on Latino USA, which is gossip, is that when we would drive from Hyde Park, Chicago to Mexico every year, all 6 of us in the car, when the closer we got to Mexico, Mom would start saying, bueno, déjame contarles el chisme, let me tell you the gossip. And it was like the chisme. And my mom would start telling these stories about this tia and that tia and this tío and who did this. And I had a revelation where I was like, I may not be able to write, but I know how to tell you a good story. I know how to tell you a story. And when I went to CNN after being at NPR and was very traumatized by having to do television, I was like, I'm going to tell this story to my mom. And that's how I would write. That's how I would write, was if I was telling the story to my mom. And when you do podcasting, I mean, Suave is really documentary work. I mean, it's just decades of phone calls, taped. Very deep kind of documentary work. And then Garcia Luna is, it was like, this is a story that is waiting to be told in this way, with a bottle of tequila, with 2 women journalists who are completely obsessed, having fun and laughing, and also being very serious. So for me, it's very different heads, and people are asking me to write another book, and I'm like, why? But I want to write another book because it's another way in which you're using that journalist brain muscle. But the most liberating and freest is definitely, for me, in the podcast space, where you are able to be free, where now, because podcasting is everything, when I started Futuro Media, people laughed at me. They were like, oh, you're starting a nonprofit and it's focused on podcasts. It's going to do great. I'm having the last laugh, is all I'm saying.
So is there an argument for podcasting as helping journalism perform a particular function, sort of responding to what everyone's been talking about here at this conference, responding to that? Does podcasting do something particularly well or less well that helps journalism do its due diligence for a democracy?
Well, one, I think you have to have great journalists who are doing podcasts, right? I mean, I think that's one of the harder things to hear, which is just like, oh, I'm doing a podcast, and I'm like, okay, so 20 years of experience doesn't really matter, right? It's just like, I'm doing a podcast. So I think in the sense of being a collaborative, like you can express yourself, like you can have access and you can do it, podcasting is extraordinary. And not all podcasts have to have massive audiences, right? Because I think the power of a local podcast is so inspiring. I mean, I live in Manhattan, in Harlem, but I live in a very tiny community in Connecticut. And I'm like, God, I would love to do like the Chisme of Bethlehem, Connecticut. Oh my God, that's a great podcast. I should do it. I should totally do it. Right? Like the Chisme of Belén, because in Spanish, Bethlehem is Belén. Which, by the way, is a very red zone, very, very Trumpy, and I would probably use it as an example to have these conversations, and to be very hyper-local. So yes, I love that Joan is like, yes, podcasting, save us from fascism. Yes, why not? What I love about what we're hearing in terms of documenters is you can do this. Journalism is not just for the Walter Cronkites and Morley Safers of the world. You too can do it. So yeah, absolutely.
I'm aware that
Yeah, the clock is right there. We can't get away from it.
So I think we should see if people have something they want to add or ask. Can
I just ask you a question?
Sure.
You're a boxer?
No.
But you write about boxing.
That's why I'm not a boxer.
Because I'm a boxer. I am a boxer,
Right.
but I don't write about boxing, and I've never seen a boxing match except for Ali versus Frazier. Do you remember that? That was like in 1970, whatever. That was the last boxing match I saw. But anyway.
You went out on a high note, yeah.
We'll talk about boxing at another time. But yes, ask me anything.
Oh, and we have a microphone, right? So if you have something to say, just wait a second. Somebody will bring you a mic.
Oh.
Yes, sir.
You go, Julio.
Hi, I'm Julio, and I'm based in the Boston area, so whenever Maria comes here, it's such a joy for me to be with her. Do you want to talk a little bit? My question, a lot of things we've talked about is about disinformation in Spanish, the rise of Latino conservatives, the rise of Latino conservative media, a lot of funding that just has come out of nowhere in the last 2 years, like Americano media, and sort of this fascination with mainstream American journalism into like, oh my God, Latinos are conservative. Can you share more context and history as to like why that type of discovery really isn't a discovery? And can you also speak to the funding issue of how these new outlets all of a sudden are flush with millions and millions of dollars going into the 2024 election cycle?
How can I say this being nice? But after having covered so much corruption, I'm just like, there's a lot of money laundering that is happening. Did you hear me say that? Okay. I won't repeat it too loudly. But anyway, so there is no surprise about Latinos and Latinas who are conservative. Again, you heard me talking about the fact that my whole life I've been driving through Texas, especially South Texas is a part of the country where there's a long history of Latino Republicans. So that's not a surprise. I think what is surprising to Julio and I is when our colleagues in the mainstream media who do political coverage have no clue. And they're suddenly very surprised about the fact that Donald Trump could get over 25% of the Latino-Latina vote. And then they become horrified by us. It's like, what's the matter with you? And it's like, well, you don't talk to us, you don't report about us, you don't talk about us, but then you say that there's something wrong with us because you don't understand us. So to me, I love the fact that Julio brought this up, because if I start thinking about the challenges that we face just on the question of Latino, Latina media and disinformation, misinformation, I might give up. I'm not going to give up, but the onslaught of what we are facing is really extraordinary. And that's why I'm trying to tell you that reporting about Latinos and Latinas and this particular community is not just like niche reporting, and it's not understanding just these voters, it's understanding the future of our country and democracy. But having said that, and Julio, you and I haven't had a chance to talk deeply about this, but I've been in Florida and in Texas quite a bit more, and I can see how, if you are conservative Latino, Latina media, that there is a place for you to, the seeds are easy to be planted, but I can also see the reverse. The thing is that it takes effort, and it takes really understanding, and this is, I'd basically be talking to the Democratic Party, but my feeling is I shouldn't be giving you any pointers. I'm not a political operative. Y'all have been around as long as I have. You need to know this stuff. But tapping into actually the humanity of Latino and Latina voters, again, we've been talking about humanity, heart, the power of storytelling, the power of this kind of connection. So the fact that the Democratic Party would just kind of be like, well, we have nothing to say, that's the death of democracy right there. And if we don't have journalists holding them accountable to do better, that's the death of democracy right there. But don't be surprised by the rise of the right wing of Latinos and Latinas. Oh my God, when I was leaving the country last Thursday, I don't know, whenever it was that I was leaving the country. And I was in New York, and my cab driver was very talky. It was very early, and I didn't really want to talk politics, but he was like, so what do you think about DeSantis? And I was like, okay, what? And he's an Afghan refugee from Queens. And he was like, I think I like him. And then actually I did something that I normally don't do as a journalist, but I hadn't defined myself as a journalist. And I was just like, if this is what Afghanis in Queens are talking about, then we have a real problem in Queens. That was a joke. You could laugh. Okay.
Jonathan, we got time for one more?
Wow, come on. There, yes, my girl.
So, we're talking about, much of this has to do a lot with relationship with the giving.
Yes.
Like the hand of God. Dun, 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 dun. Sorry. Anyway, I'm wondering, like, internationally, as we enter 2024, I think we're looking at something like 70 elections worldwide. We have no guardrails on social media or, the benevolent dictators that once ran social media platforms have been taken over. We do have other kind of minor platforms like particularly Truth Social that are starting to ramp up their investments in incitement and sort of mobilizing another era of MAGA. But internationally, I worry that some of the things that have plagued journalism forever, like the inability to translate specific stories and ideals, and also the sort of cultural barriers that we face. Is there a way that you've seen over the course of your career, like, are there some like smaller insights or ways of quelling the anxiety around this idea of this, this ecosystem where the stories that we need to know and the stories that help us navigate our lives and the stories that help us understand what's happening in other countries, are there ways that you've seen where in your time moving through all of these different forms of media as well as communication obstacles, I guess I should say, that we can start chipping away at the edifice of what seems to be this very technocratic authoritarianism, where people like Musk or Zuckerberg, to some extent, what's been happening at YouTube. Are there ways in which different modes of storytelling are going to be able to overcome or circumvent or destabilize these technologies that seem to be just basic infrastructure in some level? They seem to be apolitical on some level, when in fact they're deeply political. Every dollar that Facebook moves from building the infrastructure of Facebook and protecting consumers, they move into the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which has made over $5 billion in donations to different social causes. So what I'm trying to get at in a very roundabout and confused way is, like, what are the things that you've held on to over the years that help us not feel so weighed down or crushed by the magnitude and the scale of what we're up against?
So I could give you this deep philosophical answer, but I'm actually going to quote Dolores Huerta, who is the co-founder of the United Farm Workers, and who actually came up with Si se puede, yes we can, which a certain presidential candidate named Barack Obama took. She talks about people power. And that's why we're talking about democracy, right? I mean, the core is that we really want our work to convince people that they have agency and power, right? And that agency and power can look like registering to vote or taking to the streets. So what happened, I mean, Puerto Rico, we forget, right? Because this country loves to forget that it has a colony. But Puerto Rico, the people of Puerto Rico took down a corrupt governor because of street protests that the United States can't, that the mainland and our mainstream media can't understand, like, Jesus Christ, these are American citizens. That would be like protests in New York City that became so extreme that Governor Cuomo had to resign because of the protests. No, he didn't have to resign because of the protests. Something else happened. But could you imagine if we understood that level of people power in Puerto Rico? We really understood what it would mean in the United States mainland. So I repeat to myself, because as you said, having been around and being on the ground, the overwhelming number of people in this world are actually good and want good. They do. They really, really do. So this whole way in which people in fact report about these issues, let's just take the issue of immigrants and refugees, which is like this scary horde that's going to take over. No, para nada. They are the winners. They are the most hopeful. They are the ones that will create the next media platform that we don't know, that will be just and right. So I don't know, Joan, because I am feeling very overwhelmed by the institutionality of everything, right? You're taking it to the worldwide scale. But then I think about my beginnings as a journalist in the 1980s, right? Like when I was a college student in New York City, and there were authoritarian regimes in Chile, in Argentina. There was massacres happening in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And the fact that things didn't stay stagnant, right? Things changed. I mean, Chile, the most oppressive, right, with Pinochet, ends up electing a woman, the first woman in South America to be elected president. So I hold on to that hope, mamita. But I think it's up to all of us. And when you're like, what do I do? And I feel silly. Because I go on Instagram. And I'm like, okay, Mark, how am I helping you right now? But I have producers who are like, Maria, we're going to put you on TikTok. We're going to put you on TikTok because you know this, right? That right now the fastest growing platforms for news delivery in our country are Instagram and TikTok. So we have to be there. But we do it respecting, right? With a tremendous amount of respect, like we don't talk down to you. We have humility. I think as journalists, it's something that we have to have. I think that's what Ed Bradley had, frankly, and taught me. But we have to encourage people to believe that they can be on these platforms and change history. And I mean, I'm inspired by you, Joan. We had never met, but I'm just like, dude, Joan is out there in the world. Things are good. We have to continue to inspire each other for the long haul. And that's why, if there were younger journalists in the room, I'd be telling them, it's not going to happen fast. And there's not going to be a linear. But this is about understanding why we do what we do, which is why I wrote that speech this morning, why I do what I do. Because ultimately, that's the only thing I can hang on to. And this inspiration from all of you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was really a fascinating presentation. I think you are an exemplar of how the news media can helpfully pervade our lives, our social lives, our political lives. That your career is really testifies to how journalists can highlight forgotten issues and spur debate on reforms and remedies. So when democratic institutions become deadlocked, when we begin to lose hope or despair, there's something that we can grasp onto in order to give ourselves a life raft. So the news helps citizens know better the reality of their own country, their own backyard, and provides the spark, I think, for many to catalyze action. I want to thank Carlo Rotella as well for moderating this final keynote session. Carlo, as many of you know, is one of the founders of journalism at BC, and so especially glad that he could be part of it. And I want to say that, Maria, your charisma, your story is a reminder to all of us just what a special combination it takes to convey meaningful information in a way that people can hold on to it and retain it. And that's a really special gift, and it's quite fitting that you've won all of the awards named after whoever, whatever group. So this symposium marks the culmination of our year of programming on journalism and democracy. I encourage you all to check out our Clough journal dedicated to this topic, produced by our student fellows. You can find the journal on our website. If you're interested in following up, please do so. I just want to thank a few people, because with an event with so many moving parts, as you can imagine, there are a lot of folks involved. For all of their organizational assistance, from the Center for Centers, Julia Barrett, Gori Pandy, Sue Dunn. Just want to start by saying thank you to Chris Burns and his entire team, taking on an early 20th century and installing 21st century communications and getting us up and running. We're very grateful. Meetings and technology service events at BC. I want to thank the campus crews who brought the tables in, took the tables out, made sure the chairs got from one place to another. And then finally, a special thanks to Nicholas Hayes-Mota, Assistant Director of the Center, for all he's done in support of Symposium, all while simultaneously finishing his PhD thesis. Thank you, Nicholas. And finally, to the Clough Fellows, thank you all for helping create a community and for welcoming this amazing cast of academics and journalists who have graced us, truly graced us with a few days of their presence and attention. And I think this will remain with many of us for a long time. So thank you all for being here.